Donald Trump asking a foreign government to undercut Democratic opponents at home. Now, this isn't a story about Russia, if you're listening, or a story about Trump admitting he's open to foreign help in the 2020 campaign. Those are two times that Trump has faced bipartisan rebukes for welcoming help from Russia. Well, tonight, it's President Trump seeking help from Israel to retaliate against two Democratic politicians, the first two women who are Muslim women in Congress. And before I even get to these details right now, I want to present you with some pieces of context. First, Donald Trump tonight, right now, having done this, is totally isolated. He is facing rebukes, we can report, from Democrats and Republicans, from national security experts and civil libertarians, from liberal Jewish groups, and from more conservative U.S.-Israel groups like AIPAC. So there's a lot of blowback already on this brand new news. And second, before I present you with the facts, and we will, please understand, this does not appear to be a story about foreign policy or national security. It's a story about a long-running partisan feud with the Squad. In fact, it was just about a month ago that Trump told the recently elected women of color they should, quote, go back to the crime-infested places they allegedly came from. Well, tonight, he has a foreign government that will now deny them entry by publicly bullying Israel's administration to reverse itself. Because right here, you see, just last month, Israel specifically said the congresswomen were allowed to visit, and that was out of respect for the U.S. Congress. Now, President Trump urging Israel to bar Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and alleging their policy views amount to basically a disgraceful hatred of Israel. So within hours of Trump posting that, the Israeli government reverses itself and gave in, blocking their visit. Now, as a technical diplomatic matter, countries may decide who enters. Israel has a law that actually authorizes the possible denial of entry to people who support boycotts of Israel, and Omar and Tlaib do. But foreign policy experts and Middle East experts say that's not what this is about at all tonight. In fact, they know that because Israel was planning to admit them and had said so on the record. And an Israeli journalist is now reporting the reason Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu made this reversal was because of, quote, the pressure from Donald Trump, which is why so many top American Jewish organizations and AIPAC, as mentioned, oppose this Trump tactic. So there's a lot going on, kind of a lot even inside the story. Let's just take this in. You have these groups and experts who work on these foreign policy issues for a living. Some of them, as you probably know, are critical of these very congresswomen. And these groups don't think this story is about foreign policy. They think it's something else, and they think it's dangerous, and they want it to stop. They think it's President Trump exploiting their work to double down on his long-running attacks on these women of color who lead the liberal resistance to Trump. As you know, he told them last month to go back where they came from. That very attack on them earning Trump his historic rebuke by the U.S. House, the first such vote in over 100 years, that declared a sitting president advanced, quote, racism. The same attack that his own supporters repeated back to him in that ugly chant that he basked in at a rally. When that footage went around the country, when it was on the internet, when it was on TV, all that next day, there were people who asked if Donald Trump condoned those lines. That is way too gentle a question. Donald Trump wrote those lines. He brought up that discriminatory frame. He stoked the anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim fervor. And then it was yelled back. And we know that discriminatory motivation because he ran on it, telling similar MAGA crowds back in 2016 that he was running on doing something unconstitutional. He wanted to ban an entire religion from migrating to America.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
Is there a link from running for president on banning Muslim travel to governing as president by engineering the ban of travel by the president's most prominent Muslim political opponent? Is a MAGA hat red? Tonight, Congresswoman Omar notes Trump has gotten another country to implement a version of Trump's Muslim ban, noting this time against two duly elected members of Congress. This is not a drill. This retaliation is not being done in secret, where there might be some alleged debate about the cause and motives. The cause is clear: a foreign government buckling to Trump, who wields the power and the might of the United States in the world. The motive is same as it ever was. It's become somewhat normal to note the president's words and deeds are not normal, which is more of a problem than a paradox if you think about it. It's become common to hear the objections that Trump violates traditions. Well, tonight the experts and the neutral referees are quite clear. The Associated Press reporting Trump's move is completely unprecedented. The Washington Post reporting on an extraordinary intervention by Trump to seek foreign retaliation against these domestic opponents, while Trump's critics at the New York Times editorial board say this is new territory, even for Donald Trump. I'm joined by Mark Ginsburg, former U.S. ambassador to Morocco and a presidential advisor on the Middle East, conservative journalist Bill Kristol, director of the group Defending Democracy Together, and civil rights attorney and former prosecutor Maya Wiley. Good evening to each of you. Maya, is this on the level?
Nope. It's not on the level. And, you know, you already laid it out quite clearly. And if we just go back even in terms of history, right? You know, we have a long history in this country of members of Congress going to foreign countries in order to understand what they think the policy positions of the United States should be. And that's actually something that the Constitution of the United States sanctions. So here, you know, where you had a Dennis Hastert who went abroad, even though the White House was upset about it, but the White House never, you know, went and called, you know, Colombia and said, don't let him in. You have Nancy Pelosi in 2007 when she went to Syria. You had all kinds of, Ronald Reagan didn't like it when then Speaker of the House Jim Wright went and started negotiating a peace agreement with the Sandinistas, thanks to, you know, former President Arias. You know, long history. Frankly, in some of those instances, even the congressional members overstepped their hand. Newt Gingrich did it when he went to mainland China and said, oh, yeah, don't come for Taiwan or we'll come for you. And that was actually not the law of the land in the United States when he said it. Nobody prevented them from traveling. They were all allowed, and even when those White Houses didn't like what they were doing, Democrat and Republican, no one stopped them. This is exactly as you said. Donald Trump actually put out a tweet that said they're Democrats and they hate Israel. Why would we ever let them, you know, why should anyone let them in? And it undermines exactly what we want a diverse Congress to be able to do. Represent multiple different experiences and positions. AIPAC did the right thing and the principled thing by saying, we don't agree with them. That's not the point here. We want them to go see and understand what's happening in Israel. That's what we should all want.
Ambassador, you hear Maya lay out the history. Have you ever seen anything like this?
No, and I used to, as ambassador, host Codels and congressmen. But I have to put this into some context, Ari. I mean, this is all about politics as local. Benjamin Netanyahu was under enormous pressure to permit these two congresswomen to come, even though just a few days before their arrival, there was a bipartisan delegation of congressmen led by Steny Hoyer, and these two congresswomen refused to be part of that. I'm no fan of the squad. I believe they were basically going to stir up a lot of mischief during this trip. However, the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu was prepared to let Israel turn into a vassal state for Donald Trump, particularly at a time when Netanyahu only cares about one thing, which is his ability to form a new government if he obtains the mandate that he needs in the September 17th election. All politics is local in Israel, and in Israel, Trump is the most popular person in Israel.
Well, you mentioned that trip. We have some footage there of the top Republicans speaking about what you're referencing, so let's see that for context.
Had I wished that she would have joined, they would have joined all of us, yeah. Join the other freshmen as well. And that we see it together. And when we work on these issues as one body, we'd have the same experiences that we're looking through. But I think it's healthy that all members come.
And saying, as you said, there may be good faith or strong disagreements about the underlying policy, but there's something you don't see every day, which is Kevin McCarthy saying, yeah, of course the squad can still come, whether or not Donald Trump has beef with them. Today, now it's all been inverted. And so, Bill Kristol, is this a story about foreign policy, or is this a story about Donald Trump?
I mean, I think it's very unfortunate that the Prime Minister of Israel buckled to Donald Trump. It's ridiculous. There are Muslim members, obviously, of the Israeli Knesset. A lot of their views are not that different, honestly, from those of these American representatives. In any case, they're representatives of our Congress, and Israel has a long tradition of welcoming such people when they don't agree with particular policies or even somewhat hostile to the state as a whole. And I'm not saying whether these people are or not, but so it's a very unfortunate thing for Israel. It's unfortunate for the U.S.-Israel relationship. I think Netanyahu, in my opinion, shouldn't have buckled. But the interesting question is, why did he? Ron Dermer, who is the ambassador of Israel to Washington, he is very close to the prime minister. He was his chief of staff, in effect, for about 4 or 5 years that he was sent here. That's obviously by far the most sensitive diplomatic post for an Israeli to occupy. Ron Dermer said, what was it, a week or two ago, you showed the quote, right, that, look, we're going to welcome them. They're members of Congress.
Yep.
It's very important for us to do that. What happened? What happened? I don't think it was just a tweet. I mean, Netanyahu is a very tough and savvy politician. If he watches Trump, he's gotten along well with Trump, too well, in my opinion. It's hurt in a sense, support for Israel here by being excessively solicitous of Trump. But you understand he's the prime minister of a small country that depends on the U.S.-Israel relationship. He could see a tweet. He could see Trump, trying to capitalize on this. But he could also say, you know what, my hands are tied. We have a legal system here. We have a long tradition. I disapprove of these people. I'm not going to meet them personally as prime minister. But, of course, they can come like anyone else can come to Israel unless they're, going to cause actual violence and damage, which there's no evidence was going to be the case this time. So why didn't he do it? How much arm twisting was there by Trump, Trump's ambassador in Israel? That's my question. Because Netanyahu is not a weakling, and I don't think he would just do it.
I think that is true. And I have a part of the answer, which is something that the three of you and the four of us have covered, which is when you look at the attempted alleged obstruction by Donald Trump, Twitter was a tool in it, but it was almost rarely used alone as a template. We know from the exhaustive account in the Mueller report and other good journalism that it would figure into a much larger pattern. Legally, that's generally considered bad because it speaks to someone's malicious intent. Here, everyone is saying this is bad, but people can judge that for themselves. But it certainly speaks to a larger drumbeat. And to Bill's point, I want to show some of the reporting out of Israel. Netanyahu's national security advisor had asked different government agencies for their opinion on whether Omar and Tlaib should enter, and that request was deemed strange because the relevant government agencies already said last week they supported letting them in. The reporting being that this had been going on for at least 2 days at the highest levels of the Israeli government against what is supposed to be, Bill, their nonpartisan policy, and would suggest that the U.S. pressure began privately by Trump before the tweet.
And it's something Congress should look into, I think. Did John Bolton call Durham, or did other Trump operatives, either political ones or government ones? What did Mike Pompeo say about this? I mean, this is a major problem, I think, for our relationship with a very close ally, and that's going to damage that relationship. It's going to make our two major political parties, the Democrats, feel that Israel is not treating Democratic members of Congress with proper respect and with some justice, unfortunately. And so how did this happen? What happened here? I think that's really, from the U.S. government point of view,
let me go to
that's
Ambassador
really worth
and then
looking into.
Ambassador and then Maya, yeah.
I just want to add here that, you have a U.S. ambassador that it's more of an agent for Israel in the United States. That is Friedman, the ambassador of the United States in Israel. And he put out a most incredible statement defending what essentially was the effort to bar these congresswomen. It's just unbelievable that Friedman is permitted to, in effect, be the behind-the-scenes lobbyist for Trump in the White House. I guarantee you that Friedman had a lot to do with convincing the Israeli government to bar these two members of Congress.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, these are the right questions and the right concerns, except what it really comes down to is Donald Trump is willing to use every lever of government for his own personal interest and advancement, and that's not why we elect presidents.
Maya Wiley, Bill Kristol, Mark Ginsburg on The Big Story. Thank you, each of you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.